Hi, and today I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the three major approaches to ethics in contemporary philosophy. And the way I'm going to do that is by filling out a table categorizing each of the three moral theories according to several different dimensions. So, great. So we've got on the top, on the top row, you see utilitarianism, Kantian ethics, and virtue ethics, or utilitarian consequentialism, Kantian deontology, and virtue ethics. Philosophers are pretty evenly split between the three. So if you look at the 2011 Philosophy Papers survey of philosophers, you've got about 25% are utilitarian, 23% are Kantian, and 18% are virtue ethicists. The remainder of the responses were made up of things like 4% think that all of ethics is wrong, 2% adopt an alternative, 1% don't respond, right? So it's all piddly percentages after these three. So let's talk about the first dimension that I want to evaluate these three moral theories, which is value monism. So whether each of the categories of ethical theories is value monist or value pluralist. To be a value monist means that you think that there is one moral value, that there is one thing that all values reduce to. So beauty, courage, truth, happiness, free speech, free choice, liberty, all of these things, do they all reduce just to one, right? Now maybe you think, well, that seems really reductionist, right? But one way to think about it is, if you have a moral theory with more than one value, you have two values, you've got problems, because you've got situations where the value is going to pull in opposite directions. And then your theory is going to have to manage the fact that it either just doesn't provide an answer, or you've got to have some sort of hierarchy of values that rank them according to each other. It tends to be the case that whenever philosophers have tried to develop a moral theory that involves more than one value, and then posit some sort of strict hierarchy of how to balance the values against each other, it just comes across as really dumb and faces a lot of problems. So another reason to think that value monism, one reason to think that this is the right approach is that this is exactly what we do, for example, in the sciences, right? You're looking for what are the fundamental laws of nature? What is the fundamental bits of matter? Like, what is the one theory that, analyzes everything else in terms of some sort of simplistic atom, some simplistic set of law, maybe not simple, but singular set of laws, low number of particles. So these moral theories are offering us a picture of value and moral rules that, well, at least two of them do, reduce things down to one, which is to say utilitarianism and Kantian ethics are both value monist. The utilitarians will take happiness and suffering, so happiness is the positive value and suffering is the negative value, as the single thing that is a value in the universe. Everything else reduces to it. So a beautiful painting is valuable because it's beautiful, but really the value of beauty reduces to the pleasure that someone gets in experiencing the beauty, right? So beauty doesn't have its own intrinsic fundamental value. Nothing does, except for happiness, according to the utilitarian. Kantian ethics is going to reduce everything to free choice. So respecting someone's free choice is going to be the number one value. Transgressions against free choice would be the one disvalue. And then virtue ethics will be the theory that says this is all wrong, right? We need to embrace the wide zoology, the elaborate classifications of all the sorts of different values that the universe possesses. It doesn't just reduce to one. So happiness, free choice, beauty, truth, courage, fairness, gumption, friendship, whatever you want, right? Just let all values be as they are. Don't try to reduce them to one another. How is the virtue ethicist going to handle the issue of conflicting values? How is the virtue ethicist going to deal with the fact that they seem to, if you've got all of these values, how do you give a rule, right? If you have happiness as the one thing, there's a value you have to maximize. For the Kantian, there's one value that you need to respect. For the virtue ethicist, there's just all sorts of stuff. How do I make a decision if I don't embrace some sort of atom to make sense of it all? We'll see, right? They're going to have their own way of doing this. Great. I gotta take a break. And we're back. So you can't tell this doesn't come across on video, but this is Sunday night in my office, and the university turns off the air conditioning on the weekends, and I have to turn off my fan to record, so it's getting kind of hot in my office. But moving on, codifiability. So codifiability means that you can produce a sort of algorithmic rule, maybe not algorithmic, but a rule which the ethical theory gives to designate actions as right or wrong. Because utilitarianism and Kantian ethics are value monists, they're able to do that. The utilitarian, whereas the virtue ethicist is not going to be able to give a rule. How do you provide an ethical theory if you don't have a rule? We'll get into that as we move on, but let's start with what the rules are. For the utilitarian, what's called the greatest happiness principle, dating back to John Stuart Mill, who called it that. So perform which of your available actions would maximize happiness, that's the right action, in the universe, and minimize suffering. Wrong actions is anything else that's available to you, right? So the right thing to do is whatever is going to add the most good to the world, make the universe a better place. In the grand scheme of the history of the universe, if you can do something that means that in the whole, if you calculated up all the happiness and suffering in the universe over the course of the entire history of it, if you can make it such that there is more happiness and less suffering in that history, that's the right action. And if there's something else that doesn't do that, that's what you shouldn't do. So that's the utilitarian action. For the Kantians are also going to say there's just one moral rule, but there's at least two candidates for it. Kant himself, who is the originator of Kantian ethics, don't think of Kantian ethics as just trying to explain what Kant thought. Really, he's more like the originator of the theory in the way that like Newtonian physics comes from Newton and Einsteinian physics starts with Einstein. But it's not that we're just trying to make sense of what Kant said. We're trying to develop and further develop and prove some form of moral theory that dates back to its beginning with Kant. So there are two formulations or proposals for what the categorical imperative are. They're roughly the same. They come to the same result in a lot of cases. They're sort of getting at the same thing, but they do seem like they're different and they come to different results. So as a Kantian, you're going to have to choose one or the other, or you're going to need to come up with some way in which they really amount to the same thing. Anyway, so let's talk about what the two proposals are. One is the formula of universal law: only perform an act for a goal if that act type could be the universal way of accomplishing that goal type for people with that goal in relevantly similar circumstances. So for example, cutting in line to get something I want quicker. Could everybody cut in line to get something they want quicker in similar circumstances to me? No, because if I'm just cutting in line because I want something quicker at the ATM, if everybody was doing the same thing, there wouldn't be a line to cut in front of, and the rule by my proposed act for a goal wouldn't work. Formula of humanity: don't treat people merely as tools for the accomplishment of my goals. So the idea here is something like the value of things in the universe, hammers, money, cars, etc., they're valuable only in terms of me accomplishing I decide to do things, and then all of a sudden stuff becomes valuable or not valuable in terms of how they are instrumentally valuable for me to accomplish the goals I've chosen. So I have this value bestowing power that makes things worthwhile doing. And the formula of humanity says, don't treat other people like that. Don't treat them like tools. Don't treat them as instrumental things just to be used like I treat everything else. Treat them like I treat myself, or actually the formula of humanity says I need to treat myself in this way. I need to treat myself and others as the sort of value bestowing, the thing that makes stuff important, as opposed to something that's used to accomplish goals. Great. And then we've got the virtue ethicist. For the virtue ethicist, since they're value pluralists, they're not going to be able to have a rule. The way they're going to provide an ethical theory, or what they're going to say ethics is about, it's about having good character that governs, that's a skill for navigating the world that's not rule-based. So what is that like? So for example, writing a poem, right? Being a good poet. I can't write a set of rules for what makes a good poem. I can't write a list of instructions that I give this incredibly uncreative, immature kid how to write poetry, and then he reads it, and then he's good at writing poems, right? You have to be shaped by the world, you have to have experience, you have to succeed and fail, and slowly you become the sort of person who's able to have the right sort of creative thoughts, have the right sort of self-critical voice, the right sort of sense of being able to take risks with things that, maybe this isn't a good idea for a poem, but actually there's something here, I want to push forward and see if I can't write something great, and then actually write good stuff. Like, all of that is a skill, just like swimming. Swimming is something, if I asked you, how do you do it? You're like, I don't know, I just move my arms like this. Like, it's not something that you swim. I mean, swim lessons is not done in a classroom. Swim lessons is you grab a kid and you throw them in the pool, and maybe you hold them and while they try to move their arms, and eventually they learn to have the right impulses, the right mechanical motions that come to mind when they want to stay afloat, right? It's a skill that you get rather than a rule that you learn is justified and follow. And virtue ethicists want to say ethics is like that. Human life, succeeding at human life, being good at navigating the multitude of values that the virtue ethicists say exist, happiness, free choice, beauty, truth. They're not going to give us a hierarchy of how to balance these values against each other. They're going to say that's a skill. It's a skill that can't be codified into a set of rule or a hierarchy. Instead, it's this really messy combinations of things that in every different circumstance balances differently, and to be good at navigating those values to make good judgments takes skill rather than learning a rule. So we've got two moral theories which give us a rule, a codifiable rule, and then we've got virtue ethicists who take this alternative approach of a skill-based moral theory, which is why it's called virtue ethicists, right? Ethics. It's because those skills are called virtues. Great. So now let's talk, I don't know what to say about, I don't know how to call this row, but I'll call it type. But each one of these moral theories is of a very different type. The utilitarian is what we call consequentialist. It's goal-focused. It says maximizing happiness and minimize suffering is the moral goal, and you should subjugate all of your other goals to accomplishing that one thing. So if you want to be a professional Halo player, you should quit that, because that is not the career choice you should make. If you're trying to maximize happiness and minimize suffering in the world, it's probably something like either being a charity worker, but really something more like becoming a Wall Street banker where you just make tons of money and then donate 90% of it to charity. The point being is that there is a goal that if you're ethical, you're pursuing, and you're subjugating everything else you do in your life as instrumental towards accomplishing that goal. Kantian ethics is not like that. We call this deontology. Ethics is a side constraint. It doesn't really tell you what goal to have in your life. You can be a professional Halo player, you can be an ornithologist, you can be a politician, you can be a gas station worker, whatever. Whatever you want to do with your life, Kantian ethics isn't going to tell you what the right answer is. It doesn't set the goals for you. What it does do is set side constraints. Side constraints which tell you, in pursuing your career, your life goal of being the best Halo player in the history of the world, don't lie, cheat, and steal in your pursuit of that goal, right? So these are side constraints on how you pursue a goal. Don't use other people as tools in the pursuit of your goals. Or, if we're using the formula of universal law, don't, in your pursuit of whatever goals you choose for yourself, don't perform an action for a goal that couldn't be the universal way of people accomplishing that type of goal. Anyway, lastly, we've got virtue ethics, and as we've already seen, it's this character-focused view. It's like, it's not that there's a rule that governs actions, but rather virtue ethics is going to talk about the sort of character you need to have to be a good human being, to be a mature, skilled person who can succeed at life through being so good at life, not through pure luck. Of course, I think the virtue ethicist is going to accept that luck is a component in living a good human life, but that there is this large part which is just you being so skilled and so mature and so experienced and so able to navigate friendships and balance the needs of friends against your own autonomy, against when I need to tell a lie to keep someone happy because it would be too cruel to let them know something, versus, yeah, this is going to make them unhappy, but the right thing to do in this case is to tell them the truth. All of that is an element of character. Do you have the skill to be good at balancing these value judgments into coming to finally a good conclusion about what you need to do, the right decision about what you need to do? It's so hot. Okay, so the last bit. We've talked about the types, and now those types come with differences in the way that they see or conceive of immorality, right? So sometimes this is traditionally talked about in terms of sins of temptation versus sins of ignorance. Do we think of immorality as failures where you give in to temptation, or where you were ignorant or not that it was you were tempted out of doing wrongdoing, but you were just unable to see the right thing? A colleague of mine really hates this talk of temptation and ignorance, partially because ignorance makes it seem like it's not your fault. Here's maybe a better, dropping the sort of historical terminology that might be a little bit couched in religious things. Here's a better way of thinking about it. Failures of will versus failures of character. Two of the moral theories, and you can guess which two, because it's the same two every time, see immorality as failures of will. That you know what the right thing is to do, but you are tempted to doing something selfish or something you want to do that's not the right thing. One of the moral theories is going to say, it's not that, what is the one? It's virtue ethics. It's not that, for the virtue ethics, it's not that I know what the right, I'm trying to be a good friend or succeed at life or navigate some difficult social situation and smooth over the awkwardness and then say the right thing. And I just fucking don't know what it is, right? It's a failure of maturity and ability and experience and skill. It's that I'm not good at human life yet. I'm immature or whatever. So that's going to be the virtue ethicist position, whereas for utilitarianism and Kantianism, it's much more, morality is much more like, a big rule on the wall that says, don't go through this door, and then I put a lot of money or I set your room on fire, and then you really want to go through that door, but you know the rule, and whether you go through the door or not is whether you're tempted to break the rule or not. Okay, relativism. So are any of these moral theories relativistic, or do they take an objective point of view, saying that, there's an objective right answer that doesn't depend on what you believe is right or doesn't depend on your culture? Well, all of them are not going to be relativistic. Utilitarianism is going to say happiness is good, suffering is bad. That's just a property in the universe, just like mass or charge or anything like that. And then if you're giving a full description of the universe, you're missing out if you're failing to notice that happiness is good and suffering is bad. For the Kantian, there's a logical commitment that every agent makes to the value of free will and everyone else's free will. So you are being irrational when you act in ways, you're contradicting your own values when you act immorally. The virtue ethicist, it sounds relativistic because they're talking about being a good human being and the traits that are required to succeed at human life. Here's one way to push back against the sort of relativism charge for the virtue ethicist. They're not talking about being a good Iranian or a good American. They're talking about features, the skills that are required to succeed at human life in general. It's dealing with social interactions. It's dealing with truth. It's dealing with danger. You can think of a firefighter, not a firefighter. I come across a fire. If I just run into danger at any and don't care about danger at all to save people or save a cat or whatever, I might end up getting myself into a worse position, and then firefighters have to risk their lives to come save me. Being able to make decisions about how to deal with danger, how much self-preservation to have, those are sort of generic human characteristics that the virtue ethicist is intending to talk about. They're not talking about any particular culture. All right, lastly, let's just talk about the three different sorts of fundamental arguments that these moral theories give for why they contend to be the one true moral theory. So the utilitarian, there's lots of ways to do this, but here's two ways. One is experience. So the claim is, if you think about having seeing the color red, seeing the color green, and then I hear a high-pitched noise, I notice that green and red are of a different character than the high-pitched noise. And I can notice the similarity between green and red and their shared difference with the high-pitched noise from the quality of the experience. I can have the experience and I notice properties about those experiences. Similarly, the utilitarian might argue that when we experience pleasure, we're like, whoa, wait, that is different from red. That is different from a high-pitched noise. That has goodness, right? So one way to argue for utilitarianism, you look over the grand expanse of everything in the universe, chairs, tables, pyramids, the experience of red, high-pitched noises, all of them seem value neutral. Maybe things like truth and beauty seem to have value, but really the thing is that we notice has value happiness, which then seems to explain the value of everything else, which gets us to the second sort of argument for utilitarianism, is it offers us theoretical unity. It's able to explain the value of everything else and reduce it to one common currency, one atom that is able to explain everything else that seems valuable. Courage seems valuable, honesty seems valuable, but you can cash that out in terms of how honesty is usually the policy that leads to more happiness in the universe. And dishonesty, is often something where I have a character trait that leads me to be dishonest, which is to do things which bring me a lot of happiness, but at the cost of other people's suffering, such that it lowers the overall happiness and raises the overall suffering of the universe, even if it benefits me and my personal balance of happiness and suffering. Great. So that's the sort of utilitarian argument. Let's talk about Kantian. For Kantians, immorality is going to be irrational. And why? They're going to say inbuilt into the very nature of being an agent, being a person who makes decisions, makes long-term decisions against temptation and follows through on them, is a commitment to Kantianism, commitment to the Kantian values. So, for example, what is the difference between me just laying in bed and saying, I'm going to become a firefighter, and me deciding to be a firefighter? Well, if I decide to be a firefighter, I have to get up out of bed, be motivated to go do a bunch of stuff that's really hard, and I have to overcome that temptation. That means I really have to care about my own decisions. I have to think, well, I was laying in bed, being a firefighter was not important for me, but then I decided it. I could have decided something else, but I decided this, and now I see it as one of the important things for me to do, and I'm willing to push through it. That's the sort of the difference between valuing goals just because I've chosen them, just because I've set them for myself. I treat myself as having that power. I treat myself as saying, just because I've decided to do this, I've stepped back from my temptations. I'm not just being blindly pushed around by impulses and desires of the moment. I've thought about what to do, and I have chosen something, and now I'm going to push through my impulses to do that. That is a sort of self-respect that the Kantian thinks is required to make decisions, because if you lacked it, you would never follow through on any of your decisions. You would just say, I'm going to become a firefighter, and then you would lay in bed and do nothing because you don't value your own decisions. Here's the tricky part. The Kantian wants to say, you can't have that same, logically, you can't have that same sort of valuing of yourself unless you value other people's similar decisions for themselves. There's a lot of ways that Kantians make this argument. One way to think about it is, I think my choices matter. I have the standing, the right to choose things and make them valuable because I'm free and I'm free from impulse and I can make decisions for myself. I can't see my decisions as having value if I don't treat other people's decisions as having that same sort of power and value bestowing ability. So that's the sort of Kantian move to justify a moral position, a moral rule that says valuing your own free will, but other people's free choices is the one moral requirement. Notice that the utilitarian will make sense of the normal value we place on free will in terms of, well, respecting free will tends to be the policy that brings happiness for people. When you impose your own decisions on others, you make them unhappy. Maybe you start to make wrong decisions because you're being authoritarian and you don't need to check yourself. And so power goes to your head, and then you start making bad decisions. So respecting free choice is justified for the utilitarian in terms of free will, in terms of happiness. For the Kantian, the value of happiness is going to be reduced to the value of free will. Everything's value is reduced to the value of free will. if somebody wants happiness for themselves, the reason I don't cause them suffering is because I'm respecting their choices, not because happiness has some intrinsic value or suffering has some intrinsic disvalue. It's that I have to respect their choice. If someone's free choice, they're a stoic or they don't care about happiness, then happiness would have no value. Whereas for the utilitarian, happiness always has value. That is the one thing that's valuable in the universe. Okay, lastly, for the virtue ethicist, one way for arguing for the virtue ethicist, one common way, is that we need to think about goodness and badness in terms of the same way we think about inanimate objects like knives. A good knife is one that cuts well. A good house is one that provides shelter. Like, good of its type. What is a good knife depends on the type of thing a knife is. It's a thing that cuts, so it needs to be sharp. A good knife is not one that hunts well. A good knife is not one that does math. I mean, that's not the type of thing a knife is. Similarly, a tortoise, a slow tortoise is not a defective tortoise. A slow cheetah is a defective cheetah. So the standard by evaluating something depends on the kind of thing it is. And the virtue ethicist wants to apply that same sort of thinking that we use for other types of things in the universe to human beings. That's what ethics is concerned with what it is to be a good or bad human being. And they think that we're the sort of thing that takes in information about our environment and then weighs that correctly to make good judgments in order to succeed at human life. That involves being able to weigh these values, these many values, correctly in the context of a particular situation and then make a good judgment, a judgment that leads to a successful human life. Successful human life being one that just includes all of these values, right? One that has happiness and one where I'm successful and happy and have money and friends and get to exercise my free choice and autonomy and influence the world, all that sort of stuff through my great skill, my ability to lead human life in the way that humans lead lives, which is through taking in information, weighing it, through our skill being able to weigh it correctly and make good judgments. Great. So that is my table of the 3 moral theories. And, there's so much more to say about all 3 of them. But here's one way to contrast the 3 of them. Great. I'm going to get out of this hot box of an office. Good night.